Welcome to part 2 of our expose on China's fake population numbers. And if you thought part 1 was shocking, you haven't seen anything yet. Last time we walked through the math, the logic, and the broken foundations of China's 1.4 billion population myth, from fake fertility rates to ghost towns and empty villages. But there's one event that ripped the mask off everything: COVID-19. Today we dig into how COVID exposed the truth, how many might have really died, and why the CCP could no longer cover up the collapse of its demographic fantasy. So buckle up, we're going deep into the darkest chapter yet, the funeral fires, the missing millions, and the irreversible damage to China's future. We all remember the early days of the pandemic, China locking down Wuhan, the entire city, and then bragging that they had conquered the virus with only a few thousand deaths, while the rest of the world just struggled. Those of us who know the CCP's track record knew that those low death figures were total BS from day one. But even I was shocked later when I learned some of the whispers and truths coming out of China about what really happened. So let's be clear. The CCP has never been honest about its COVID deaths. Officially, China claims around 5,000 to 6,000 died in the first wave. Laughably low for a country of 1.4 billion. And then, after maintaining zero COVID for 2 years, they abruptly dropped all restrictions in late 2022. What followed that sudden reopening was catastrophic. Reports of overwhelmed hospitals, medicine shortages, crematoriums running 24/7 for weeks on end. But even after that, the CCP tried to claim only tens of thousands died in that wave. No one believed that. Independent estimates from researchers and health experts put the deaths in the millions just for the late 2022 outbreak alone. Some estimates say 1 to 2 million elderly could have perished in a matter of months after zero COVID was suddenly lifted, given China's low vaccination rates among seniors and a very easily overwhelmed health system. Now, millions of deaths is tragic, but remember, we are investigating a discrepancy of hundreds of millions in population. COVID alone wouldn't kill 500 million people, thank God. So I'm not going to claim that COVID killed 500 million Chinese, right? That would be too absurd. And there's no evidence of anything remotely that apocalyptic. But COVID may have been the straw that breaks the facade, accelerating population decline and making it harder for China to hide the truth. Consider this. If China's real population was already, say, around 1.1 billion, not 1.4, pre-pandemic, due to all the reasons we discussed yesterday in part 1, including low births, inflated data, etc., and then COVID swept through, if even conservatively 10 million people died from COVID, which is completely plausible if you consider multiple waves across such a huge country. That would bring 1.1 billion down to 1.09 billion. If more died, say 20 million or more, which is possible over several waves, and especially if you include indirect deaths, overwhelmed healthcare system, causing other untreated illnesses, etc., you drop to maybe 1.07 billion. Now, adding the normal aging related deaths, which in China amount to about 10 million plus per year anyway, and the births are at record lows, around 9 million in 2022 officially, in reality much less. So each year, they're losing people on net. All of a sudden, it's entirely conceivable that China's actual population in 2023 could be under 1 billion already, perhaps around 900 something million. It might not have dipped all the way to 900 flat yet, but even if it's 1 billion, 1.0 billion, that's so far off from 1.4 billion that the truth would rock the world. There was one bizarre data point early in the pandemic that raised eyebrows. In the first few months of 2022, Chinese telecom companies reported that 21 million cell phone accounts were discontinued. Now, there can be various reasons, right? Migrant workers losing jobs, people consolidating dual cell phone accounts, etc. But you have to wonder, could it indicate excess deaths that people didn't think to formally report, but their cell phone accounts going dead was a clue? Hard to say, but intriguing. Imagine if even a fraction of those were actual deaths that went unaccounted. It hints the toll was way higher than 3,000 as they claimed at the time. Regardless of the exact COVID numbers, here's what is clear. COVID pushed China's already teetering demographics over the edge. In 2022, China finally admitted its population shrank for the first time in 60 years since the Great Famine of the early 1960s. They reported a tiny decline, like 850,000 people less, which is likely still sugar-coated. The real decline was probably much larger. And that's assuming their baseline was truthful to begin with. Some brave and controversial analysts have thrown out really extreme estimates, claiming tens or even hundreds of millions may have died from COVID in China, based on unverified leaked data or extrapolating cremation numbers. I'm personally skeptical of the very high end of those claims. A death toll in the hundreds of millions seems logically impossible to hide completely. If 500 million people died, the country will literally be invisible collapse, which, as bad as things are, we haven't seen, that level of societal breakdown. So I'm not going to go that far. However, even a moderate scenario of, say, 20 to 30 million excess deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic would significantly accelerate the population drop. The key point for us is this. COVID is likely masking a massive population drop because the CCP can now attribute some population decline to unexpected factors, rather than admit it was going to happen anyway due to their lies. They can mix the COVID deaths into the missing millions and still not come clean about the prior inflation of data. But one way or the other, the cat is escaping the bag. We might never know the exact impact of COVID on China's population, but it certainly didn't help the CCP's big lie, if anything. It made the gap between friction and reality too large to paper over. By now, you're likely convinced that something is very wrong with China's population figures. But you might wonder, why? Why would a government lie about something so fundamental? What do they gain from that lie? Well, in the CCP's case, everything. Here are the main reasons they choose to lie. Number 1, power and image. The CCP's legitimacy often rests on projecting strengths, success, and a narrative that it is leading China to greatness. Admitting that the population is shrinking, or much smaller than claimed, would be admitting a kind of colossal failure. Remember, the CCP implemented the one-child policy. If that policy led to population collapse, that is on them. Much easier to fudge the numbers and maintain the illusion that all is well. We're still strong and growing. There's a psychological aspect. 1.4 billion sounds formidable, intimidating. If it came out that China only has, say, 900 million, it just doesn't have the same ring, does it? It would be a blow to national pride and the CCP's ego. They have built up this narrative of being the world's largest population for so long. Losing that title, especially to rival countries like India, is unacceptable to them. So they delay and deny. Number 2, economic mirage, attracting investment. China's economic miracle these past decades was fueled by foreign investment and companies eager to tap the world's biggest market. If you are Apple, Volkswagen, or any global firm, the idea of selling to 1.4 billion consumers is a huge draw. But if the real consumer base is actually 900 million and shrinking, that's a very different calculus. The CCP doesn't want investors to think China is becoming a demographic desert because, that might scare them off or reduce investments. So they keep up the appearances to sustain an economic mirage. They want their market to sound larger than life. It's like a company lying about its user base to boost stock prices, like the infamous Enron, but in demographic form. Number 3, social stability and control. Population data ties into a lot of policies, pensions, military recruitment, education planning, etc. If suddenly it was revealed that there are far fewer young people and far more old people proportionally, people might panic about pension solvency or healthcare, or wonder why their towns are emptying out. The CCP is paranoid about social unrest, so better to just keep people in the dark. They probably assume an average citizen wouldn't notice a missing 100 million here or there as long as day-to-day life goes on. Number 4, buying time. The CCP might know internally that the population is way lower. At least some in the leadership might. But they figure they can manage the decline quietly. Maybe hope for some, baby uptick. They have tried everything from lifting birth limits to propaganda pushing women to have more babies now. And they likely hoped to delay the day of reckoning. Lying gave them time. Also they sought, time to try to fix things or at least ensure the leadership in power now isn't the one holding the bag when truth comes out. Number 5, centralized data control. Unlike open societies, China can censor and punish those who question official stats. So it's easier for them to sustain a lie because independent verification is near impossible. Demographers like Yi Fuxian, who raised alarms, got censored or banned in China. So the CCP might have felt confident they could just maintain the deception indefinitely. But reality has a way of catching up. The lie is now crashing headlong into the truth. Why? Because you can only cover up the effects of demographics for so long. China's workforce is shrinking each year. Schools in many regions are seeing far fewer new students. Universities are graduating fewer people or struggling to fill their seats in some places. The army recruitment pool is dwindling. And let's be real, a lot of single children don't want to sign up to potentially be their cannon fodder. The economy is slowing down partly because there just aren't as many young people and workers and consumers anymore. And housing, oh boy, housing. The entire real estate sector in China, which is a huge chunk of their GDP, was predicated on ever-growing demand for homes. That's imploding now as it becomes clear that the demographics aren't there to support it. If you wonder why giant developers like Evergrande suddenly went bankrupt, one major reason is they kept building for a population that the CCP promised would exist. But that was a lie. Now, there's massive oversupply of housing and not enough families to move in. As you can see now, the lie served CCP's short-term interests, but it is creating a long-term catastrophe. You've probably heard the phrase, demography is destiny. While China's destiny looks a lot bleaker once you peel back the fake population numbers. If the real population is indeed closer to 900 million or even 1 billion, and on a steep downward trajectory, we're going to witness something truly unprecedented. The collapse of a major nation's population and economy in tandem, or under an authoritarian regime in denial. Let's paint the picture of what's coming in blunt terms. First, a rapidly aging society. China already has one of the fastest aging populations in the world. If the total population is smaller, much smaller than we thought, the percentage of elderly is actually higher than official stats. They have fewer young people to support more older people. This is a recipe for fiscal and social crisis. Pensions will go bust. Healthcare system overwhelmed. A shrinking tax base trying to care for a growing retired base. Even the CCP's own premier recently admitted that the demographic dividend is disappearing. No kidding. It probably disappeared years ago. They just wouldn't admit it until now. Second, shrinking workforce and economic slowdown. The era of China as the world's factory was built on abandoned cheap labor. That labor force is now shrinking and wages have risen. If the real population is much smaller, the labor pool could dry up even faster. Productivity gains can mask this only so much. Fewer workers means less growth. Japan and others know this story, but China will feel it faster because they're hitting the wall at a very much lower stage of economic development and without the same level of innovation or automation yet to compensate. Some estimates say China's working age population has been falling since 2012. Is it a coincidence that China's super high GDP growth also started faltering around then? Not at all. Part of why they had 10% growth for years was workforce growth. That party is over. Third, deflation and ghost economy. We're already seeing hints of deflation in China, prices falling as demand weakens. A shrinking population means shrinking domestic consumption, period. You can't keep selling more cars and phones if each year there are few people, and especially fewer young, new consumers entering the market. Japan had deflation for decades due to an aging, shrinking population. And Japan had honest data and a high-income economy to cushion that blow. China has lies and a middle income with that economy. The landing will be much harder for China. Next, real estate collapse. This one is practically guaranteed. Real estate in China is, to put it sharply, screwed. They built enough housing for a population that might have been 1.5 or 1.6 billion by now if trends continued. But if it is actually under 1 billion and heading much lower, there's a massive glut. Home prices are already stagnating or dropping in many areas, and developers are going belly up. Local governments, which rely on land sales for revenue, are in deep trouble as demand for new land evaporates. This is the pop of a gigantic bubble. And unlike in the West, where populations still grow due to immigration, in China there isn't such relief. A ghost apartment today is likely a ghost apartment forever. Now, let's not forget about the debt and Ponzi economics. The CCP has been piling up debt to keep the growth illusion alive. If population, the ultimate economic input, is contracting, how will they ever service that debt? They won't. Not without printing money or defaulting, or a combination of ugly fixes. The miracle might unravel into an economic nightmare. China's economy is a Ponzi scheme requiring constant expansion. Well, with fewer people each year, the base of the pyramid is shrinking. You know what happens to a Ponzi when new entrants dry up? It collapses. Now, what about the geopolitical impact? A lot of China's swagger on the world stage assumes its massive population equals massive power. Soldiers, workers, consumers. If in reality they are already far fewer and aging, then their window for challenging the US as the dominant superpower might already be closing, if it ever truly existed. We could soon see a China that is graying, inwardly focused on caring for its grandparents, unable to fill its factories or military ranks, and struggling to keep its economy afloat. Not exactly the juggernaut we've been told to fear. The CCP knows this, which is why they're desperate to keep the illusion of strength for as long as possible. Let's also not forget about social unrest and collapse of confidence, perhaps the scariest prospect for the CCP. When the Chinese people themselves realize the extent of the demographic crisis, there could be widespread anxiety, anger, and pure disillusionment. Young people are already suffering from what is being called the lying flat syndrome, 躺平. giving up on chasing careers or homes because everything just feels futile. If you add in failing social security, ghost cities, and a government that lied to them about having a rosy future, that's Tinder for unrest. The CCP's nightmare is Chinese citizens waking up and saying, "We've been lied to, and now we are left holding the bag in a shrinking, decaying society." I'll be calling it now. The collapse of China's population lie will lead to the collapse of China's economy as we know it, and potentially even the regime's collapse. For at least, I'm putting this on the record, right? It might not happen overnight, but the trajectory I think is already set. You can't base real long-term prosperity on fake people. China lied about the population, and the real number might just shock you, right? I've laid out how we logically get to a figure like 900 million, give or take. Maybe it's 1.0 billion, maybe it's even lower. But in any case, it is dramatically less than what the CCP has been selling to its people and to the world. This is more than just a statistic. It is a revealing insight into how the Chinese Communist Party operates. They will just lie about anything, even the number of souls under their rule, to maintain this image and power. But reality is catching up with them. You can fudge data, but you cannot fudge the sight of an empty village, and the pain of a generation that is missing. You can't conjure new babies out of thin air when your policies made people stop having them. Eventually, the truth comes home to roost. As someone who has watched China for decades, calling out its fake GDP numbers, its propaganda, its human rights abuses, I can tell you, this population lie is possibly China's biggest self-deception. They have essentially undermined their own future for short-term gains and vanity. It is a ticking time bomb that is now starting to explode in slow motion. What happens when the world realizes China isn't 1.4 billion strong, but maybe only 1.0 billion and falling? For one, global businesses might rethink their strategies. Less building China, sell to China, more maybe look at India or somewhere else with real growth. Global power indices will be recalculated. The notion that 1 in 5 people on Earth is Chinese might become outdated. It could very well flip by late this century. 1 in 5 people might be African, while China shrinks to 1 in 10 or less. The CCP's worst fear, losing a top population spot, has already happened, with India overtaking them. And if our analysis so far is correct, China actually lost that race years ago, but just didn't tell anybody. For the Chinese people, my heart goes out for them. They have been the victims of a grand illusion. Many will face the harsh reality of supporting parents and grandparents with no siblings because of the one-child policy and far fewer resources, and a government that spent decades lying about it instead of preparing for it. The Chinese dream that Xi Jinping touted may turn into a nightmare of elderly care and ghost towns if nothing changes. For the rest of the world, let this be a lesson. Don't blindly trust CCP stats. ever. Verify, question, and be prepared for the truth to be far less rosy than the propaganda. We've seen it with their COVID numbers, with their economic numbers, their fake GDP numbers, and now with their population numbers. I know this has been a long journey, and if you have made it this far with me, thank you for sticking with me, through this very extensive breakdown. It's a very complex topic, but I just felt like it was important to really dissect it thoroughly, because the claim that China only has 900 million people is a bombshell, and I wanted you to see every piece of evidence and reasoning that leads me to that conclusion. The CCP's lies are catching up with them. A country cannot lie about its people without eventually facing the consequences. The real number shocked you? Good. It should shock everyone into understanding that the CCP is not infallible. It is desperate to hide a slow, inevitable collapse that it brought on itself. China's leaders lied about their population to look stronger, but in doing so, they've only made themselves weaker in the long term. And as this truth comes out, it's going to be one hell of a reality check for the world. In the next 30 years, we might just witness the greatest demographic and economic implosion in modern history. Thank you for watching and listening to this expose. Until next time, take care and stay sharp. The truth has a way of prevailing, and we will be here to speak it boldly when it does.